Chapter 1. The day the war began. The morning of February 23, 2022, was not unusual or strange for me, but rather the most standard. As every day before, I woke up and went to work, where I worked at a regional television channel. I worked as a video editor, collecting news stories and programs, making titles for programs, and occasionally sitting on a prompter during live broadcasts. And that morning, I drove out as usual in the direction of our office, and while I was driving, and nothing around me foreshadowed trouble, except for the Ukrainian army combat vehicles, which at that time were parked in a small cluster at the exit from the village where I lived. I did not attach much importance to this at the time, because the type of combat vehicles and their presence in those days had not been surprising for a long time, because the war in it had been going on in Donbass for about 8 years. Many times rockets flew into the edges were flying away from us towards the occupied territories, so the military and their equipment were quite commonplace. While I was on the bus, I was listening to music on my headphones and I wasn't looking at the internet. When I got off at the stop I needed in the city, I saw that the gas station at one of the intersections was cordoned off by the police, and a little further away from them, a lot of military men in uniform were grouped around a truck. I thought, another combat mission, but I didn't pay attention to what I saw, and calmly, at my usual pace, I walked on foot to the city center, to my work. I like long walks since my childhood, and it took me about 1 hour to get there. When I arrived at my workplace, I sat down at my PC and started opening the editing program, when suddenly came my colleague at work, Irina, somewhat funny in appearance, but in its own way attractive. She was very nervous and asked if I knew what happened this morning. At that moment, with us in the office was our friend and video editor, Sasha, a large guy of athletic build, in addition, sometimes worked also as a trainer in the gym. He had a certain specific feature. One of his eyes was not real, although you wouldn't know it from the outside. He told me that as a child, he had been shot in the eye with a BB gun and had lost it ever since. However, this did not prevent him from becoming a good video editor and a similar sports coach. He was a brilliant guy, and he was also a great driver. Sasha and I didn't know what had happened until Ira showed up. She informed us that this morning, Russia attacked Ukraine. I remember I didn't even believe it. It seemed crazy to me. I started reading the news, and everything was confirmed. Russia attacked Ukrainian facilities all over the country. Unfortunately, it was true. If someone had told me a few years ago that this would happen, I would never have believed it. But the fact remains. Naturally, on that day, our work took on a much greater meaning than on any other day, as we began to cover military events online and keep people informed about what was happening. There was a lot of work to do, and increasing every minute. It was like an endless avalanche of news. From that day on, our channel began to produce 3 or 4 news broadcasts a day instead of the traditional evening news broadcast. At that time, we had a wonderful director named Valentina, who was very demanding and very decent. Valentina was responsible for all the news broadcasts, and she had a mission. In her life, she had already escaped from the war at the beginning of the hostilities in Donbass in 2014 to 2015. Then she escaped from the pursuit, running on the roofs of buildings in Donetsk, when she and other employees of the Donetsk channel were being chased by militia. She managed to escape. And now again, she was our main conductor, although she was on edge, tense as a string. Valia was acting abruptly and was very worried, but she still maintained the level of professionalism. That day, we produced many worthy news stories. Unfortunately, 2 years later, Valia will be gone. But a new day came, and I went to work again. I remember taking my red bike, which I had recently bought for good money on the advice of a cousin. The bike was stylish, durable, cool, and looked very professional, but it didn't have fenders, which caused the mud from its wheels to splatter all over my clothes. The next day, I drove to work, and as I was driving, I saw multiple rocket launchers on the road ahead of me, grouped together to strike the advancing Russian troops. The grads, as we used to call them, were stationed outside the village where I lived, not in it. But it was still alarming, as any missile salvo was a signal of a potential attack by the Russians, and it could have been directed at the private homes of innocent residents. Regardless, civilians are always more vulnerable in such situations. On that day, I was cycling to work, passing familiar places, some of which would soon disappear from the face of the earth. But I didn't know that at the time, I was simply riding my bike, driven by the desire to get to work. In those days, I enjoyed my work more than ever before, feeling a sense of belonging to something that was important and meaningful to most people. At that time, television became a tool for me to inform the public about what was happening, and it was a good platform for me to express myself. I felt like I was a part of important events that the world was watching, as if I was at the center of the most significant things, and that was true. It was exciting in the studio, everyone was worried, as something was happening. The morning news bulletin on 10, quick editing, the constant coffee nearby, and Valya's instructions. A well-coordinated, precise, structured work. I remember the mood as if it were yesterday. The first bulletin, then the second, the third, and immediately the fourth. At the same time, we were following the progress of the Russians along the border. They were getting closer. One village, another, getting closer to mine. Only the news reached us. Sasha went to withdraw all our money from our bank cards during a break, so that we would have at least some money. In those days, there were endless queues of people at the ATMs, trying to withdraw their money to survive, and the banks had limited the amount of cash that could be withdrawn to 1,000 hryvnias per attempt. The ATMs only dispensed 1,000 hryvnias, regardless of the amount on your card. Sasha stood there for a long time, but he completed his mission. I'm still grateful to him, because without that money, things would have been more difficult for me. He came back, gave us all our cards and our money, which he managed to cash, and joined in the work. We worked like a team, collaborating to achieve quick results. The boss came in and encouraged us. We had an interesting boss, and I liked him as a person. He talked to us and then left. And when the evening broadcasts were over and it was time to go home, there were already reports of missiles hitting the city's left bank. Then the lights went out. From the window of our office on the third floor, I could see that the left bank was plunged into darkness. But I knew that I would be going home through the left bank, and it was an exciting feeling, as the city was filled with anticipation. Life had come to a standstill. I didn't know that I would never see some of my colleagues again, and that the channel I had worked for 5 years would disappear forever in a few days. The office will be burned later, and I will see a photo of the building after the shelling. I will also see a video of the upper floors where our offices were located on fire. But that would be later, and at the time, after work, the building still looked good and functioned perfectly. I said goodbye to my colleagues, took my sports bike, and went home through the night city. I remember the whole Mariupol on this last day, almost empty streets, no cars, few people, and the stopped factory Azovstal. It was huge, stretched over a few kilometers. Along the fence of the factory was the route, and parallel to the route was the sidewalk, where I was cycling. For the first time in my memory, the factory was not working, but completely silent. A stopped-up metallurgical giant. Soon it would be made into ruins, but I didn't know that at the time. I was driving and getting closer to the turn to Kalinovka, so was the name of the village through which I had to pass. A gloomy night, silence, a stopped factory, and an alarming atmosphere in the air, emptiness around and some people here and there on the streets. I remember I met a few cyclists on the way. Some guys were riding on an empty highway, where there were no cars. They were joking, shouting, and discussing something. And I was thinking about that moment, in which there was something unforgettable, strange, memorable for life. And soon I turned off the main road and drove through the private sector. Even then, I could hear the sound of heavy artillery fire. At that time, the war in Ukraine was primarily an artillery war. I left Azovstal behind me, and I never saw it again. Many times before, I had passed through it, through its coal and slag-laden trains, through its moving cranes and locomotives on the elevated areas, through its smoking chimneys, and through its endless metal structures, but now it was all coming to an end. The factory always gave me a bad feeling. It was a harsh place, even from the outside. I remember that there were always fishermen hanging out at the water discharge point from Azovstal. Any Mariupol resident will remember that. I don't remember if I saw any fishermen with spiders and fishing rods by the river that night, but it's possible that someone was fishing near the factory, but I can't say for sure. In any case, the factory was already behind me, and I was moving on. I was turning right in an adjacent street when I saw a Ukrainian armored personnel carrier with young boys was rushing somewhere ahead along the highway, speeding past the huge city dump which was almost adjacent to Azovstal. These were large mounds of packed garbage, where thousands of seagulls circled from time immemorial in search of something to profit from the garbage. The armored personnel carrier was driving on the highway, and I was driving on the sidewalk. And somewhere in front of me, it stopped, and I turned off to the side, on the turn leading to Kalinovka. It was a cold day, and I was breathing steam, but I continued to drive, sinking into the darkness. The streets were dark, and part of the city and settlements where I passed were already without lighting. Moving down a private street, I saw how the sky was illuminated by flying shells of the Grad, and somewhere in space, carried away by the sound of volleys. This is Grad, worked on by the Russians. And the further I moved, the stronger and more frequent shots were heard. Soon, the fences were replaced by the rumble of heavy artillery, sending shells into the darkness of the night into the unknown. It was like some kind of hell, no other way to describe it. All you could see was the glow, and the volleys, the glow and the volleys. Something was flying somewhere, but no one knew where. I didn't understand what was happening, and death could have come at any moment. I continued to drive, passing by houses where candles or lamps were burning in the windows, gas generators were running, and people were anxiously discussing their concerns. At that time, no one could have known for sure what was happening. The sky and the earth continued to shake from the gunshots, and the shells flew into the air, cutting through the space, leaving only waves in their wake. The more I drove, the more I felt like I was going to some kind of hell, where there was only darkness, death, and fear. In the distance, the sky was sparkling, and the world was filled with danger. After a while, Kalinovka came to an end, and I entered Sartana, a large Greek village known to many around it. It was once home to the beautiful singer Tamara Katsi, whose music videos I watched as a child on a birthday greeting program on TV, as some viewers loved her songs. It is a large and beautiful village. I loved it, and I still do. And so I entered Sartana, and I heard the rumble of moving equipment, how it grows. Something heavy was being dragged through one of its main streets, and it was broken equipment. The equipment was coming from the battles for other villages, closer to the borders, from where the Russians were advancing. I remember that heavy sound, the grinding. It was not easy, but I decided then not to stop, but to go further, home to my family. My hometown was also in darkness, no light, nothing around. When I reached the road where the wrecked equipment was being dragged, it had already disappeared somewhere in the distance. At the same time, I seemed to hear another vehicle coming down the road, but I didn't see it. When I rode my bike to the track, I saw only one consecrated stop at the local club. It was lit only because it was modern, equipped with solar panels and night lights, which gave it an ominous appearance in the midst of complete darkness. This is how I felt about reality at the time, dark, dangerous, and hellish. But my family was waiting for me, and I was in a hurry to get home. I pushed my pedals harder and hurried to get out of the area so that I wouldn't be seen by the Ukrainian military, who might have mistaken me for a saboteur or a spy. I didn't want to get shot, and time was running out. Within half an hour, I was back home. Everyone already understood that change was coming, in its most drastic form, but we had no way to influence it. I remember arriving and meeting my dad, who was looking out of the house and standing on the steps. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes, and I went into the veranda, rolling in my red bike, which I had used maybe 2 or 3 times since I had bought it. That evening was a busy one, but it was only the beginning of things. The main events happened days later, and it developed very rapidly. The next day, I woke up to shells falling around my house. Never before have shells landed so close to us. I even smelled gunpowder. The house was shaking, and the shock wave in my room damaged the second door and shattered the glass in the window from another part of the house. The roof was slightly damaged by shrapnel. The first floor suffered much more damage. Part of the windows and the whole door were blown out. The fence was shattered by fragments, and one of the fallen shells destroyed part of a house on a nearby street. We went outside and saw that a shell had fallen and exploded on a neighboring plot. The same shell exploded in our garden, and other miraculously, as in a checkerboard pattern, fell into the gardens and between the houses of other neighbors, without killing anyone. Miracle. Lucky. This morning was a turning point. I remember how excited I was then, because death walked over us, making it clear how defenseless we were. She showed us her face, her mighty power to take everything away at once and take us with her to the realm of eternal rest. After the shelling, we hurriedly began to sweep the windows and throw out the debris so as not to get hurt. Dad brought the film, and they began to hammer the windows in order to slightly reduce the influence of the frost in the yard. February. Fortunately, it wasn't too cold, but still, even a slight frost created big problems. We removed the windows, hastily patched up the holes, and went outside to assess the extent of the damage and the impact sites. After making sure that everything was all right, everyone was waiting for a continuation, for new falling shells, but there were none. Everything was quiet. But for how long? No one knew at the time. Everything is quiet. But for how long? No one knew at the time. However, it was clear that the volley was deliberately aimed at civilian homes, but miraculously, the shells landed in a staggered pattern, causing minimal damage and no fatalities. The mayor of the village even came to our street to check on our safety and the condition of the street. Everything was fine, and everyone was alive. My neighbor's roof was damaged, so they soon brought him a stack of new shingles. Driven by excitement and uncertainty, I went to my uncle's home to discuss with his sons, my cousins, what had happened. There was no light at home that morning, of course, because, as I wrote earlier, it had disappeared the previous evening. It was boring at home, and there was not much to do, so I went to visit. I must admit that my village is very large, and I could walk around for hours, which I decided to do before visiting my uncle's house. As I was walking along, I suddenly heard a plane in the sky, and then a strange sound, like a falling projectile. Then there was an explosion. The ground shook beneath my feet, and the houses around me trembled. Black smoke rose from the tops of the winter trees. At first, I thought that the bomb had been dropped outside the village, at the grain silo where the Ukrainian troops were stationed, but I soon realized that their target was not just the Ukrainian military. After shaking myself off after the bomb fell, because I was so scared that I even crouched down at the time, because I didn't know where the bomb was falling, just a buzzing sound, and nothing else. The sky was cloudy, and there was no sign of the plane, just the sound of its approach and departure. People didn't realize that they were already being bombed by the Air Force. Everything that was happening seemed like a dream, like something that wasn't real, as if I had entered a different reality where, even though I was in the midst of the events, it still felt like it wasn't happening to me. The events were too unrealistic, too cruel, and too foolish. After recovering from the first air attack, I hurried home to my brothers and uncle, and as I was walking, I heard the terrifying sound of an airplane again, and I even saw it flying very low, and then it dropped another bomb. On peaceful houses, on ordinary people, and then another one, in another place, also on peaceful people. Not on military facilities, as they like to say on TV, not on a column of vehicles or a company of soldiers, but on ordinary civilian houses where people were living. These bombs caused the houses to disappear, turning them into piles of debris and dust. This was done by Russian aircraft. When I came home to my uncle, I sat in his house and thought that at any moment a plane could arrive and bury us in this house as well, so the gatherings with the brothers could be the last. This created its own specific moment, because you don't know what will happen in the next moment. There was no light, planes were flying over the village and dropping bombs, and in the morning, we had almost been killed by falling shells, but now we were sitting by the stove, discussing what was happening, not knowing what to expect from the future. But it became clear that the village was going to be blown to smithereens. The question was, what should we do? At that time, my mother was barely able to walk, so it didn't seem reasonable to move her anywhere, and frankly, we didn't know where to go or if we should go at all. So we decided to stay, although it was scary, I won't deny it. Before I was hit by air strikes, I wasn't afraid of much in life, but the bombs from the sky showed me what fear is. Soon, my older brother came to visit my uncle. He was also excited and didn't know what to expect. We were all very worried at the time, my brothers, my uncle and aunt, and my parents. Everyone. I started receiving calls from my work and friends, asking about our lives and whether everything was okay. Some people even suggested evacuating, but my parents and I decided to stay. At first, we discussed the options of how and where to go, because it seemed that at any moment the village could be shelled by artillery or bombed by airstrikes, as the Russians had demonstrated that they were capable of bombing civilian homes and exterminating civilians without any regret or compassion, so there was no hope for any leniency on their part. But what could we do? It was clear that we had to survive, but how? And most importantly, where? At that moment, no place of stay seemed completely reliable, because a plane could fly in and drop a bomb, or a SAM shell could fall, and a lot of other things could happen. And putting the people who offered us evacuation in danger of being killed on the way to us is also not a smart thing to do, and it would be difficult for my mother to move, and it would not be easy for us, because we would have to take our money and personal belongings and leave our usual conditions. But we had to make a choice, so we decided to stay in our home, in our place. As it turned out later, it was a very good decision. It saved us a lot and helped us to keep our lives and our health, but then it was unknown what would happen. So we just waited for the next morning. In the evening of the same day, Russian aircraft struck a part of the village that was clearly visible from our house. After dropping several bombs on the peaceful homes of the residents, they immediately added more destruction with mortar attacks, turning the once beautiful area into a scene from an apocalypse movie. Some of the houses caught fire and burned on the horizon, illuminated by the setting sun. It was a horrifying sight. It was equally terrible that it was impossible to help the people who had been shelled, because the shelling could resume at any moment. The damage was irreparable. What was done was done. After a while, I found out that a young man and several other people had been killed in the bombings. We had hidden in the house, hoping that if a plane dropped a bomb on it, it would be able to withstand 1 or 2 hits, although this was naive. However, when there is no other choice, one can only rely on God's mercy and luck. Fortunately, nothing fell on the house, and the mortar shells did not hit us. But what awaits us next? Will everyone destroy everything, or will they leave something intact? It's unknown. It's as if it was all a dream, a parallel universe, and the world has descended into darkness and people's actions have become illogical to me. I've been watching what the Russians are doing, and I don't understand why they're doing it. Why are they destroying? Why are they killing? Why? There are no answers. The people in power are crazy, the people with guns are crazy, and everyone is crazy. What is happening? Night fell, and darkness reigned, and only the village houses were burning on the hill. Meanwhile, the planes were flying over the city and dropping bombs on it. Each time they flew, they dropped bombs, and the ground shook. It was like hell on earth. I still couldn't believe what was happening. It seemed unreal, otherworldly, and unrealistic. The familiar, peaceful world suddenly disappeared into thin air, and a battlefield was formed, where at any moment life could end forever. This continued throughout the night: planes, bombs, airstrikes. Sometimes I could hear artillery fire, but mostly, because of the distance between the city and our village, we didn't hear the artillery shells fall, but we did hear the heavy bombs. It was completely unclear what to expect next. We were without electricity, and soon the gas supply was cut off. The water disappeared last, I think the next day, if I remember correctly. It was late February, and it was cold, with a light snowfall during the night. I remember going outside to see what was going on, and it was dark, and there was no one there, and there was no light, and there were only a few dogs barking, and there was a winter moon shining in the sky. There was something ominous about it. Our dog came out of its kennel, but it didn't say anything. I listened to the sounds around me and looked around the space. That night was scary, and nothing was clear, so we realized that with the onset of morning, we needed to get out of the house, because with the dawn they could bomb us. In the evening, I received calls from my colleagues at work, who offered me options for evacuation. I even managed to reach out to the Ministry of Emergency Situations and request evacuation from the dangerous area. However, I received a hesitant response from the dispatcher, who stated that there was no longer an option for evacuation and advised me to use the buses that were transporting people from my village. But all this was already shaky, and there was no other option than to stay put or to get out somehow, on your own, hoping for luck, but where? Therefore, we stayed in our house until morning, and when dawn came, I took my bicycle and went to get help, hoping that I would be able to call the police or find someone who would come to our house in a car and pick up my parents and brother. I must admit that the feeling of being in such a tense situation at night, with bombers flying overhead and artillery shells exploding nearby, was very stressful. You feel defenseless, crushed, powerless, in fear, and without the option of choice. Just nothing, you can't do it, and living like this, sleeping like this, it's hard. You become terrified, tense, nervous, mentally unstable, conflict-ridden, and so on. Whoever has lived this experience understands what I'm writing about. In this initial atmosphere of fear, the first night was spent in active combat. In the morning, as I mentioned earlier, I took my new bicycle, which I had barely used, and, in violation of the curfew, I set out to find help. I knew that I could be killed if I was seen riding, but I was focused on saving my family rather than my own safety. In those days, thousands of people acted rejectedly, risking, because time was running out, and every moment could bring irreparable changes to the situation, so procrastination, it was unacceptable. My parents were afraid for me, they dissuaded me, but I went to get help anyway. Besides, it was 6 a.m., and at 7 a.m. the shelling had already begun, as it had the day before. The Russians started their attacks at 7 in the morning, as scheduled. Well, I set out. The sun was already rising, but the sky was just beginning to turn blue. I tried to get to the police station in the center of the village as quickly as possible. When I reached the main road, there was no one in front of me or behind me. However, I felt a sense of fear, as if someone was watching me from the side, and at any moment, a car or an airplane could appear and shoot me. With this fear inside me, I covered meter after meter. When I rolled down the main road and was about to turn right, I saw a crater from a fallen shell on the side of the road, and a fallen pole with torn wires. Apparently, an aerial bomb had been dropped here during the night or even in the morning, but I couldn't imagine who they were trying to hit, as there was no equipment in the area. At that moment, it seemed to me that even such craters are dangerous, as if there were unexploded shells inside them and they could detonate at any moment. But it was empty. I continued driving, meeting no one on the way. After some time, I turned off the main highway and drove to the center, where the police station was located. As I approached the school, I saw the first monstrous destruction that had occurred overnight. Some houses on the streets were severely damaged by hits, especially those near the school. There were also holes in the ground in front of the school itself, and then they continued. I saw a lot of people gathered outside the school. They were hiding there, but I went on to the center. As I approached it, I smelled gunpowder, very pungent and penetrating, and in the space, it was as if death itself was walking. The roofs of the buildings were badly damaged, broken glass from blown-out storefronts lay everywhere, a bread stall turned into an incinerated piece of metal and brick, and the supermarket, lost, the entrance doors. It was creepy. I drove up to the police station, started knocking on the windows, but no one came out, and there were mobile phones on duty on the front window and on the door. Needless to say, they couldn't get through. Realizing that it was late and that there was no one there, I decided to find someone who could pick up my parents and brother to bring them to the school for shelter. And at that moment, the first morning volleys were heard. I fell to the asphalt, waiting for the shells to land. They started falling, but it didn't feel like they were landing in my village, but somewhere beyond it. After waiting, I got up, mounted my bike, and quickly rode away. After about 5 minutes of riding, I realized that my bike's wheel was punctured. It couldn't move properly. Deciding that I didn't want to puncture the second tire, I rolled it with my hands, almost running with it to school. There were more volleys, after which I hastily put my bike against the school fence and fell face down on the ground, my heels against the ground. I remember how vulnerable and afraid I felt. It wasn't an airstrike, but it was scary, believe me. The volleys ended, and the shells landed somewhere, and I quickly ran back to the school, and once inside, I immediately looked for someone to take me home to get my family. There were several cars there, and I asked everyone who could help, but the drivers said there was no fuel and that it was very dangerous because the planes were flying and destroying any moving targets. Later, one of the villagers told me, in a few hours, "I'll drive you." Having calmed down a little, nevertheless, I was still worried, because they remained there, and I was here, and at any moment the plane could drop a bomb on our house, and anything could happen. But I had no strength to somehow influence the course of events. And, since I was in the school, there was no only in waiting, so I went to the basement of the school and began to look around, what was in it, what to what. There were already a lot of people in the basements, hiding from airstrikes and bombings, and slowly organizing their lives. Some people were already stealing things from the damaged stores, but most people were staying put, afraid to go outside, because at any moment a plane could fly over and launch a missile or bomb. Soon, this happened. Since the planes appeared incredibly quickly, it was difficult to hide inside the basement in time, because to be on the lookout all the time. However, one appeared, dropping a shell on the school. Explosion. Hit. People like hunted animals hit on the lower floor of the building, which was also very dangerous, because if the upper floors collapse, or the exits are destroyed, then it will be impossible to get out, and if no one comes to the rescue, then you can die alive. A stalemate. However, the military did not care. Pilots periodically reminded of themselves, flying above us. And how scary it is, when you are in the dark, to think about your relatives, what happened to them, how they are, and whether they are all right. With all this, you cannot help them in any way. You get depressed and hysterical about your own helplessness in this situation. But all I could do was wait. And I waited, occasionally going outside to make sure that the driver who had said he would help me bring my family back wouldn't back out. However, he had his own problems, and more people kept arriving at the school. Everyone was hiding in the basement. And again the sound of the damned fighter, again the impact, and the shaking of the walls of the building. I remember thinking at the time that if these planes were to hit the walls of the school with their shells like this, over and over again, they would quickly turn it into dust. But fortunately, this did not happen. That morning, I still saw Ukrainian soldiers with yellow armbands on their arms and legs, and later in the day, I also saw them, as they had not yet been driven out of my village, so there were many of them in the city and its surroundings. Meanwhile, more and more people were arriving at the school. In the basement of the school, I met my cousin and his parents, my uncle and aunt. They had been there since the night before, and it was a good decision, as it was too risky to stay in their homes. The basement rooms were already filled with people, and many had set up makeshift beds with blankets and even brought some food, candles, and other supplies. Then everything was needed. Other rooms were also occupied by people, and some kind of local boss was already in charge of the situation, trying to create more or less acceptable conditions for the residents of the basement. Fortunately, he was successful in this endeavor. He kept shouting, "Go to the basement. Go to the basement. Hide." He was a smart man, and I remember him. Besides, every now and then he scolded someone who decided to stand on the street or crowd in the doorway when the plane was once again rushing through the sky, saying, "What the hell are you doing hanging around here? Let's run and hide." I remember that at some point, 2 or 3 hours after I arrived at school, my parents and my brother suddenly showed up. Fortunately, they were brought by a neighbor who was in a hurry to get his mother to our school to escape the bombings. By luck, my father stopped his car and asked if he could take them to school as well. The neighbor agreed. My dad and brother quickly loaded my mom into the minibus, and the 3 of us arrived at the school, where we all settled in one of the basement rooms. Unfortunately, my parents didn't have any serious blankets or covers with them, so we had to go back home to get them. However, my brother and I also realized that we could get the blankets from the destroyed house across the street, where an aerial bomb had caused half of the building to collapse. I remember going with him, and I thought that now we could go inside and find their mutilated corpses in their beds, or what worse, the remains of bodies scattered around the rooms, but instead, there was no one in the house. Several times we called the owners of the house from behind the wall, staying outside, but no one answered, so we went inside. There we took 2 blankets, with the idea of returning them after a while, when it would be easier. When we were about to leave, we heard the roar of an airplane overhead. I fell to the floor in fright, but my brother remained standing, his head slightly bowed. The bombers dropped something heavy somewhere, causing the ground to shake beneath us, but we remained unharmed, as did the house. With the blankets in our hands, we hurried outside and saw a group of soldiers walking along the road in our direction. We didn't stop. I thought they might open fire on us, as we were essentially looting, but they didn't. These were Ukrainian soldiers, with yellow armbands and leg bands. They seemed to be leaving our village. Once we were back at school, we hurried downstairs to bring a blanket to my mother, who was barely able to walk. Then my father and I went to the store to get some food and other necessary items, such as matches, batteries, paper, and more. At that time, we didn't have a clear understanding of how much to take, as we needed everything. My dad, I, and other men went to the center for food, because someone told us that the store was open and you could go and get what you needed. It's clear that it was looting, but in those circumstances, it was vital. We set out in a small group, about 8 people. On the way to the busted supermarket, we met several people who were already returning from there with bags full of food and all sorts of things, who encouraged us that there was a lot of food, enough for everyone, and that today is a free day. Without hesitating any more, we accelerated our pace, because at any moment, new shells could fly or soldiers could arrive with checks. And so we went to the supermarket. There were some local residents already there, filling their bags with groceries, because not everyone was hiding in the school basement, and most people were staying at home for various reasons. I started putting all sorts of products in my basket, including canned goods, fruits, and more. My father grabbed a few bottles of vodka and also picked up some canned goods. At that time, many people were buying vodka, especially men. So, we hastily and chaotically picked up all sorts of things, and very quickly left the supermarket. We came in a group, we left in a group, because it was not worth spreading out, and almost simultaneously, everyone went back to the school. On the way there, we met a new group of walkers, as well as single figures, and in general, people were coming from everywhere for the goods, while it was possible to take. When we returned to school, we went straight to the basement. I remember entering the room with a basket of groceries in my hands. As I walked in, everyone's hands reached out to grab the food I was carrying, and it quickly disappeared before our eyes. At that time, I didn't forbid anyone from taking what they wanted, as I believed it was the right thing to do. However, a few days later, my perspective would change. However, when I was walking to my room, half of the items in my shopping cart disappeared down the hallway, but I wasn't upset. On the contrary, I was happy because I had helped some people who had been underground all this time. After we returned to our abode, we began to give the goods we had acquired to the women who were in charge of the food in our room. They carefully placed them under the makeshift table, separating the butter from the canned goods and so on. We then took a break and lay down to rest. My mother was worried and asked us about our experience, what we had brought back, and so on. I loved my mother. She was a very practical and intelligent woman, and she knew what was what. But her health wasn't very good in those days, so she didn't participate much in the daily life of the basement dwellers. She didn't have time for herself. She spent most of her time sitting on the bed, as it was difficult for her to lie down and walk, so sitting was the only option available to her. Before the war, she often sat in her armchair at home and watched various TV series, where she would fall asleep in front of her laptop monitor. I always wondered how she managed to find so many movies and TV series to watch, as she seemed to have seen everything in the world. Sometimes she would discuss the art films she had watched with me, and while it was sometimes interesting, it was often not. I think many of you have had mothers or grandmothers like mine who spent hours in front of a PC or TV, watching everything on, and spending the rest of the day searching for more and more news feeds to watch. But let's return to the basement. Life was in full swing there. People started cooking soup and something else, but it was still unsafe outside. Nevertheless, the planes stopped attacking. Everyone was already waiting for the soldiers to arrive, as we were periodically informed by our superiors. Previously, the DPR soldiers had already arrived and discovered that there were no Ukrainian soldiers hiding in the school, after which the Air Force was ordered to stop dropping bombs. It was already an offensive infantry operation, so everyone stayed where they were, and from time to time, we could hear the planes just flying over our heads, heading into the city to eliminate it. In those days, we decided to live in the basement with the other residents of the village, because it was dangerous to return home. However, my father only stayed in the basement for one full day, or maybe two, I can't remember exactly. I only remember how my father and I went to the supermarket to take groceries on several occasions, and then how the woman who self-proclaimed herself food manager began to divide it up in the basement. My father was tired of sitting in the basement in idleness, and went home first of all of us. I followed him, and my older brother stayed with my mom. That's how we started living. I was with my dad, then I went to school for half a day, back and forth. This went on for 2 or 3 days. Personally, I spent a total of 5 days in the school basement, of which I spent only 1 night there. That night, I was freezing cold, to the point where the saying, "my teeth were chattering," became a literal truth. I was so cold that I made up my mind, I'd rather have an aerial shell fall on my head and die from it than to freeze like a stray dog in the cold, dark basements of the school, which shook every time another shell was dropped. At home, my father built a small stove, connecting it to the chimney and sealing the holes with clay. He gathered firewood and started the stove from time to time. He did all this in the bathroom, because it was the most comfortable place to live. It was small, and it was the most suitable place of all. All the windows in the living room had been broken since the day the shells landed, and one window in the kitchen had also been broken. The bedroom was simply not suitable for these purposes. So we started living together in this room, sleeping in it, cooking in it on the stove, and keeping warm in it, because the other rooms were very cold. After all, it was the beginning of March. 3 days later, my mother said she wanted to come home, and we brought her back. I don't remember how or who helped us, but we brought her back. My father even considered bringing her home in a wheelbarrow, but it didn't happen. From that moment on, we all lived together again in our large, cozy home, which we had built ourselves over the years. By that time, my father had already brought home a lot of groceries from the supermarkets, and we already had some of the products, such as cereals, sugar, salt, canned goods, and jam, since I had stocked up on food for a possible emergency before the war. My supply was small, but it was quite enough for the first days of the war, especially if you were severely saving on food costs in order to survive as long as possible, because it was unknown how long the whole confrontation could last. Back then, there was no water in the taps, gas in the pipes, and there was no light, so I had to go to the water pit, sit by the light of a kerosene lamp and candles, and warm myself from the stove with firewood. We mostly got firewood with my brother, going to the gully for twigs. Water was also mostly brought by me and he, to free my father from these. He had enough problems of his own. My mother stayed at home, monitored the stove, and cooked for all of us. Cooking was not easy at the time, as it took a long time to cook on the stove, and there was not much space, so it was often impossible to cook 3 dishes at once. We had to make do with 1 or 2 dishes. We worked hard, endured, waited, and hoped for the best. And the best gradually came into our lives, day by day. We started living in our house, getting rations and food wherever we could, and that's how our days passed. The front moved into the city, which was constantly bombed, and people were taken to our village in large numbers, making it a transit point for refugees. I remember once I went to the center for some reason, and at the intersection, I met the journalists from the first Russian channel, and since I was once a journalist myself, I decided to talk to them. When I approached them, I began to communicate with these guys, who had no idea what had happened here. Seeing the bombed-out houses, one of them asked me what had happened here, and I told him that Russian aircraft had been attacking civilians and their homes, but he didn't seem to believe me. His face expressed confusion and surprise. At this time past us passed a column of Russian troops, walking somewhere in the direction of the city. These were dirty-looking men with a bunch of weapons, but they did not evoke any noble awe or respect, as I had previously imagined the Russian army. All these people evoked only pity and disgust, because their stupidity was obvious. They left their homes in different parts of Russia and came here to bring peace and order, while they themselves lived in dirty cities and abandoned villages. They were nothing more than idiots. But who did they think they were? I don't know. However, I don't remember any heroic faces among them. They looked more like homeless people. I didn't want to stay there any longer and engage in a dialogue with the narrow-minded journalists, so my brother and I went out to find food for our home. In those days, we had to stand in long, endless lines to get bread and other groceries. Queuing up became a daily routine. I remember the time when my cousin, who was hiding in a city that was under constant attack, came home and told me that he had seen a line of people waiting for food at one of the few supermarkets that were still selling food to people during the war. It was the recounts, the only supermarket open during that time. On one of the days, one of the planes dropped a bomb on a living queue of people waiting at a supermarket. And when people died from the impact, others still stayed there until a second bomb was dropped on the supermarket itself. My brother told me a lot of interesting stories back then, about how the city was turned into a nightmare, about the close combat in the city, and about the desperate people hiding in the basements of high-rise buildings, and how these high-rise buildings were bombed, causing some of them to collapse and kill their residents. However, my brother miraculously survived and returned to the village, thank God. About a month after his stories, I was able to see for myself what the city had become. In April, the road was open, and I decided to take a chance. I set a goal, borrowed a bicycle from a friend, and set out for the city to see what had become of it. By this time, I had already learned how to navigate the city and its surroundings safely, so I set off. When I first left my village, I didn't see anything particularly alarming. But the further I went, the sadder the views became. When I approached Volontarovka, this is the name of a village near ours, I saw a pile of burnt-out vehicles on the road, and many destroyed houses. Almost all of the houses were destroyed. At that moment, I was shocked by the extent of the destruction, because everything looked terrible and completely desolate. The world I had seen every day for years was gone, replaced by ruins and piles of bricks, metal, and sticks. It was a terrible sight. I was riding through this tragic massacre, on a road strewn with shrapnel, where shells were sticking out of the asphalt here and there, and I had to carefully navigate around them to avoid being blown up. I was surprised that I managed to puncture my bicycle tire so quickly, but here. I was riding on a road strewn with shrapnel from everything in the world, and I hadn't punctured anything. It was a paradox or a stroke of luck, I couldn't tell. I was driving, and there were some military vehicles ahead of me that I had to give way to. I thought they were going to stop me, but they just kept on going. Then two more cyclists appeared in front of me, and it wasn't so scary to ride alone. When I reached one of the main intersections, called Makino, I saw a broken tram on the tracks and metal hedgehogs on the sides of the road. There were also soldiers. They didn't say anything to me, although I expected them to stop me and ask who I was and where I was going. Since they didn't check me or ask any questions, I continued on my way, intending to turn into the village of Sadki, which was open. There, I planned to visit my first acquaintance, whose house overlooked the Azovstal factory, which was still bombed, and I saw it personally. From the right bank, where I stayed, there was a good panoramic view of the metallurgical factory. I drove down to one of the lower streets and watched as another plane struck the factory buildings, turning them into ruins. At that moment, two men sitting near the yard of a private house approached me. They told me that they had their own Stalingrad here. And indeed, this was the case. They also mentioned that their neighbor's body was lying nearby, with his head gnawed off by a dog, and that he should be buried, but it's physically difficult for them. I didn't want to go and look at the headless corpse, especially since the explosion from another shell had occurred just a minute ago. It was so close that I thought, I'd better get out of here. And I did. The girl I had come to visit in the right bank for was not at home anyway. She was, as these two had told me, far away in the village, so there was no point in staying there any longer, for time was running out. As I left the right bank, I heard another shell land on Azovstal with a thud and a whistle, shaking the ground beneath my feet. After that, I went to visit a musician friend of mine who lived in the old part of the city, which was also relatively close to the plant, and had been heavily damaged by the Russians, who had destroyed the historic part of the city due to its proximity to Azovstal. As I drove, I began to realize how much of what I was used to had been reduced to rubble. It was, of course, painful on the soul from what I saw while I was driving. Each destroyed house was depressing, with many private homes looking torn apart and high-rise buildings standing like charred embers. The further I drove, the sadder the scenery became. When I turned onto Artem Avenue, I saw completely burned out 9-story buildings, black as tar. They even smelled accordingly. I never would have thought that I would see my city in such a sad state, never. About 300 meters away, there was a military bus and a group of soldiers at the intersection. My first thought was to turn into the courtyards, but I thought it might raise their suspicion, so I decided to go with the flow and continued on my way. Surprisingly, I rode past them on my bike without anyone noticing. Didn't stop me and didn't ask me anything. But a little further away, ahead, the patrolman at the intersection ordered me to come to them. It seemed very strange and unreal then, all that happened, because just a little more than a month ago, I went home every day through this intersection. I knew it by heart, and now everything is different, and more, never again will there be these trips home from work. I drove up to the military, and one of them asked if I had any cigarettes, adding that the road was blocked and I couldn't drive any further. I told them I didn't smoke, and I turned right where they told me to go. I went down the road, and then I took a different route. There were thousands of people at the police station, and I'm not kidding, they were all lined up in a single queue. Stopping, I asked where they were standing, and one of them told me that they were standing in the filtration. At that moment, I did not understand what the word filtration implies, but I did not like it. My own filtering was waiting for me about a month later, and in a completely different place. I didn't stay there for long, and I continued my journey. When I was still in the village, I asked those who had already been to the city about the situation there. I heard from someone that the soldiers at the checkpoints might confiscate valuables. Although I didn't have anything valuable with me at the time, I decided to travel light to avoid any risks. I only had my bicycle and myself, and no valuable items. After driving a little further, I came across another patrol, which stopped me. They checked me, looked if I had tattoos on my waist and legs, and let me pass, asking just where I was going. I explained that I was looking for a friend and was on my way to see him. There were no problems. Leaving another checkpoint behind me, I began to move through one of the most affected parts of the city, the central one, which was overhauled capitally just before the war. I passed the tragic drama theater, and further down the avenue, I saw the building of my work, almost completely burnt, and behind it, the old part of the city. As I rolled down the avenue, littered with debris, I could hear people's voices and see their flickering figures wandering through the empty apartments. It was unsettling, but I continued driving. My friend lived a little lower down, in the area of the Dosov. When I went down to the intersection near his house, where he taught me to play the harmonium, there was also a patrol there. As I was driving, another bomb was dropped on Azovstal every 7 or 10 minutes, which I saw and heard firsthand. I thought to myself, they've already destroyed everything. Why are they still bombing it? The soldiers at the checkpoint did not let me through, saying that it was dangerous to go further and that passage was prohibited. I looked towards the house of my friend Dmitri, but I couldn't see what condition it was in. However, the general appearance of the houses in that direction looked, to put it mildly, unimportant. After their ban, all I had to do was put up with it and move on, this time to my friend, whose daughter I was baptizing. I decided to take a detour to her house, avoiding the main streets and avenues. Instead, I took smaller streets through the private sector to avoid being spotted by the patrol. However, I still had to drive through the central avenue, Mira. There, I encountered another patrol, this time more thorough and critical than the previous ones. The soldier ordered me and 2 other guys to undress to our underwear, and he examined us all for tattoos, scars, and bruises from the rifle butts, but he didn't find anything, so I was able to pass without any problems. Next, I decided to turn around and see what my department had become where I studied. Well, I was not presented with the best picture. One of the 2 buildings of the department was completely destroyed. It seems to be a direct hit with a FAB or something else that brought down the brick walls. I studied in this building for 4 years, and they did not treat it nicely. After a short while, I arrived at my friend's house. Surprisingly, it was almost undamaged compared to the dozens and hundreds of buildings I encountered along the way. Her high-rise apartment had missing windows and broken glass, but the building itself was intact. Upon arriving, I noticed residents outside the building and decided to inquire if anyone knew the girl I was interested in. Fortunately, one of the women immediately replied that she knew her personally, but she was not here at the moment and was in another city. She's alive, I thought, and thank God for that. Maybe we'll meet in the future. Without seeing her, I decided to go to my last destination, my best friend. I headed towards him, hoping that he was alive and unharmed. When I arrived, I started knocking on his gate and calling for him, but he didn't come out. Then his mother, whom I knew well, and whose name was Allah, came out and told me where he had gone. After talking to her for a while, I went to look for him. A friend was at a neighbor's who sharpened knives on order. I remember carefully driving on the street, looking for a friend in the courtyards, and suddenly noticing him at a distance. Our eyes met, he smiled at me, and we shook hands and hugged. It was a great meeting. Then we went home with him and sat for a long time in the kitchen, drinking tea, eating condensed milk and all sorts of things, sharing our experiences and impressions. His house, like ours, was a little damaged, and the gates were cut in places by shrapnel, but overall, everything was fine and everyone was alive, which was the most important thing. In those days, my friend was not living alone, but with his girlfriend and his mother. He asked me how he could get to the other side of the city, as his girlfriend's parents lived in that area. It was impossible to get to certain parts of the city due to the destruction of some bridges and the ongoing shelling of certain parts of the city and its surroundings. But I told what I knew, and we discussed the rest. Then I realized that I was seeing my friend for the last time in my life, but I still hoped for the best and believed that I would see him again. Now, I am writing this book from far away, and he lives in a different country, so neither of us knows if we will ever see each other again. I used to come to his work all the time, and we would talk a lot about girls, the men's movement, how to meet people, and how he uses Badoo or other apps to find a partner. It was fun. At that meeting, we sat with him for 2 hours, I think, and then I went home, deciding to take a good look at the Ilyachevsky district of the city on the way back. The village where my friend lives has changed a lot in places. Houses were destroyed in many places, large craters gaped in the ground, and people wandered everywhere in large numbers from idleness. I moved to Kirov Street, which is one of the busiest areas of the city, where many burnt-out apartment buildings were concentrated. People were sitting on the streets, cooking on the streets, wandering around the streets like they had no place to go. Then I passed by many burned houses, not imagining the pain all their residents had endured. But I confess, it was sad and tragic to see my city in such a depressing state. As I drove down the avenue, I passed a car full of devotees of Krishna. They were on their way somewhere, but I couldn't talk to them because they didn't notice me. Then I saw burned-out military vehicles, endless crowds of people, and more bombed-out buildings. However, I must admit that in the Ilyachevsky district, where I went, many of the houses were without glass, but they were not burned down like in other places. I remember the sun rising in the sky, beautifully illuminating the ugly reality and the mood of the celestial luminary, as if someone had combined the incompatible for fun. It would seem to have fun and live, but no, now it only remained to grieve and recover from the nightmares experienced. I remember well how in those days I was visited by different thoughts, to leave or to stay, but more to leave, as a clear understanding of the disappearance of the familiar world had already been established inside, and the new world was not yet emerging. Only one thing was clear: it would take a lot of work to create it, and soon we really started working. If I'm not mistaken about the chronology, in those days, my village was already being restored and put in order by the local residents, who were sweeping, removing garbage, clearing debris, and so on. I also participated in this process, even cleaning houses several times, and the courtyards where Russian soldiers were stationed. And where they were, they often left behind pigsties. I remember how, in one of the garages in my village, the soldiers set up a garbage dump right in the center of the garage, throwing all sorts of trash into it. We had to remove several bags of garbage from there. This was the case in many houses. Some residents were not allowed into their own homes by the soldiers, who occupied them and refused to issue documents to their owners upon their requests. The soldiers also wrote offensive messages on poles targeting women who had relationships with the Ukrainian military, and they continued to obsessively search for anyone who had any connection to the military by the Ukrainian authorities. Sometimes soldiers came to people's homes and threatened them with violence if they didn't hand over someone to them. In general, benevolent defenders, there's nothing more to say. That's how we lived in those days, in a state of danger from all sides and at any moment, continuing to get provisions. There was still no gas, light, or water, which meant we had to do without them, but at that time, they started selling gas cylinders. At that time, not much was given out for free, except for occasional rations, and even those were not always available, but we were grateful for what we had. After returning home from the slaughtered city, I was in a depressed state, as the sight of it had greatly upset me. I was lucky, as I didn't see any corpses along the way, only destruction, but I still knew that many people had been killed, as such a total annihilation would have resulted in numerous casualties. And most importantly, I still don't understand why it was necessary to do this, to attack Ukraine. Russia showed its bloody face of a maniac. Then I turned away a huge number of my compatriots and people all over the world, and of course Ukrainians, many of whom did not separate Russia and Ukraine before, but perceived them as a single whole. I used to be one of those people, once upon a time, but not now. But let me return to myself at that time. Once again in my home, in my own space, I finally realized that there was nothing to look forward to in this new reality. As an example of this new reality, I will tell you what happened to me one day when I went out to clean the streets of my village with my fellow villagers. One day, I was sweeping the street near the school after the liberation, and I decided to talk to one of the volunteers who was cleaning the street with a broom and a shovel. I approached him to talk for a while, and after about 5 minutes, a car stopped by us. The window opened, and 2 thugs in military uniforms looked at us from there. One of them said, "What are we standing for? Why aren't we working? The village will not rebuild itself." I wanted to punch him after such words, but I couldn't, because I understood that no one would see me again after that, because it was a military face. I was then visited by the thought, after all, it was you who came here, you bombed everything here, and now you dare to tell me what and how I should do. And not are you not fucked up by our bastards. However, I was helpless, and such a position straightened my brains. The realization that I no longer had any rights or freedoms quickly opened my eyes. At any moment, I could have been taken to war or enslaved, and there would have been nothing I could do about it. Would I have accepted it? I don't think so. I would have had to resist, which would have resulted in imprisonment and humiliation. My cousin also faced this. One day, he was walking down the street when a 1 DNR soldier called out to him from the yard of a local house. He asked him then, "What are you doing? What are you waiting for? I advise you to sign a contract with the army of DNR, while it is still possible, and serve for money. Then you will be called to join the ranks anyway." Of course, he could ask, "What if I don't want to serve at all?" The answer is obvious, no one cares. I mean, don't you want to? It's something illegal and arbitrary, which is not encouraged in Russia. You're supposed to. If you don't want to obey, they'll just grab you one day, put you in a car, and take you to slaughter. Or they'll summon you, and that's the end of it. They may threaten to kill your loved ones if you don't join the militia, and I've seen such cases. So the reality is harsh. If you want to stay in Russia, be prepared for wars, and perhaps, together, to labor in correctional camps and prisons. There are no other alternatives. This is the history of Russia for centuries, because it is a concentration camp country. Humiliation, pain, suppression, abuse, and other charms of life. In those days, I saw Russia through different eyes, not those of its brainwashed patriot, but those of its victim, who suffered from their peace. Of course, I am a man, and I do not complain, but I must admit that I have been wrong about this country all these years. It turned out to be an ignorant entity with a claim to world domination, where the government is unable to provide its own population with a decent standard of living, social protection, and care, let alone for the people whom it wants to liberate and make happy by joining their original lands. I'm not saying that other nations or countries are worse or better, but I'm emphasizing that in those days, I woke up from the Russian world dream that I had been in for all these years. And I'm glad that it happened. Living a lie all your life isn't very interesting, although it might be beneficial for some people, I guess, because not everyone needs to know the truth. Sometimes, the truth can be traumatic or damaging to others. But for some, the harsh truth is better than a blind lie. Russia came to my house in the form of armed men and dropped bombs on my head. Some people might find this normal, but not me. For me, these are crimes with no statute of limitations and no justification, as I still wonder why the Russian army did what it did in my area. They killed thousands of civilians, destroyed homes mercilessly, and targeted infrastructure, but why? Let's say they chose this tactic to demotivate the population, but why is it so heartless, so cruel, so terrible? I'll never understand. I won't accept it. And it's a giant country, with endless resources and plenty of money. What more do you need, you marauders? Brains in your heads. Compassion, humanity, kindness, altruism, and care. You lack these qualities, but you have plenty of bombs, missiles, bullets, and a strong desire to humiliate, suppress, and torment others, and to kill the defenseless. I have seen this. Lord, where has humanity gone wrong? Or has it always been this sick? Sometimes I think it has. We're told that it's possible to be happy in this world. But is it true? I've met a few people who are truly happy, or even close to it. In fact, it seems that this world wasn't created for happiness, but rather for overcoming challenges, problems, and struggles. Suffering, yes. Troubles, yes. Difficulties, yes. Relief, only as a compensation, but imaginary happiness is a privilege. That's what I think about this world. And yet, a little bit of happiness is given to us by the time spent with family, with relatives, with friends. However, as I have already said, the world around me has changed, and I did not want to adapt to it, so my cousins and I decided to leave our native land together. We agreed that we would get together for the necessary filtration, without which it became almost impossible to leave the Donbass region. This is how my next stage in life began, forced immigration.